Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. First and foremost, I want to wish every single one of you a very happy new year. I hope 2020 is going to bring you some incredible things your way. In full transparency, I've tried to film this video a couple of times and every time I've done it, it just hasn't felt right. And I think I finally have a way that I can convey what I've loved in terms of eyeshadow palettes and what I haven't in a pretty clear and comprehensive way without making this video 45 minutes, because that was also the other issue. The video was just running so long because I had so many different things to say. And as you know by the title of this video, likely the thumbnail, and also what I just said, this video is going to be a beauty rewind video that is going to be focusing on the best and worst eyeshadow palettes of 2019. I honestly couldn't think of a better video to start the new year off with than to talk about one of my favorite makeup items, and that is eyeshadows. When it comes to eyeshadow palettes, I think everybody has their own preferences, and it wouldn't really be fair to film this video without telling you what I look for in an eyeshadow palette, what makes an amazing eyeshadow palette for me, and then what doesn't. And as with all of my other beauty rewind videos, I'm going to put a disclaimer on here to say what might work for me may not necessarily work for you, and vice versa. So take what I say with a grain of salt and love what you love and hate what you hate. Actually, hate's not a good word. Dislike, that's better. Since this past year has been the year of makeup launches, I think every other day we had a brand new product launch from any given brand. But I think 2019 was also the year of the indie brand. All of these independent makeup brands started popping up and creating some really cool, amazing products, different from anything else that was on the market in years prior. And that's why with most of the eyeshadow palettes that I'm going to be talking about today, they actually veer towards the independent brands rather than the typical Sephora brands that you're used to seeing. In terms of my preferences, what I look for when I shop around for eyeshadow palettes is number one, innovation. I like to see something that is different, whether it's different for the brand or just different across the board. I want to see something that just hasn't been done before, and that can include color stories. The next thing that I'm going to look for in an eyeshadow palette is obviously the quality of formula, and something that I really gravitate towards is very pigmented eyeshadows. Personally, I like an eyeshadow that has pigment to it. I mean, I want to dip my brush in it and the minute I put it on my eye, poof, I have a huge wash of color. Now don't get me wrong, I do enjoy building up some shadows, but I primarily want to work with shadows that have a lot of color to them. That's just a personal preference on my end, but I find I can get better looks when the shadows are pigmented up front, because then when I start going in and blending them, I don't blend the pigment away. Speaking of, blendability is the next thing that I look for in my shadows. I need to have something that is going to be very easy to blend. I certainly don't want to put a permanent marker to my eye and then just leave it there. I need it to buff out. I don't want any harsh edges, and that generally means that I look for a creamier or a more buttery shadow in terms of its texture. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind working with a drier formula, but it's gotta have blendability. Staying power is the next thing that I look for. I certainly want a shadow that is going to last for a long time on my oily lid, and I say that because eyeshadow generally fades and creases on me quite quickly. I do everything in my power at the forefront to make sure that I give it a fighting shot for a full day's wear, but there are some eyeshadow formulas out there that just don't work for me. And the last thing that I look for in an eyeshadow palette is packaging. I know this might be a little materialistic and you can't really judge a book by its cover, but I certainly want a palette that will come in a package that is aesthetically appealing. At least appealing enough that I can leave on my vanity and it can look like art, or something that is just going to look pretty but stores really easily. And finally, I want to talk about color story. I know I touched on it earlier, but it bears repeating. I love a palette that has a good color story. Something that will obviously be appealing to me, something that has a bit of a theme volume to it, but I also like a palette that is a one and done. I don't like carrying multiple palettes with me, especially if I'm on the go or just even working in my own home if I'm doing my makeup. I don't want to be tapping into 7 different palettes to create one look. I generally like using one palette and that is it. Generally speaking, those are all the qualities that I look for in palettes, and that dictates whether or not I'm going to spend my hard-earned money on those. And I have several amazing palettes that I want to talk about with you today, but I also have a few that made my not so loved list. And so it's time to talk about all of the amazing palettes that I have been able to experience this past year. And I'm going to start off with a brand that I recently discovered. It is called Kaleidos Makeup, and they have created some pretty cool palettes. They are on the small side. I think their packaging is incredibly innovative. This electro turquoise happens to be one of my favorite palettes. I think it is beautiful. It's got a great color scheme. I did do a full review on the Kaleidos Makeup eyeshadow palettes that I have in my collection, so feel free to head on over to that video to watch it. But generally speaking, this is an amazing palette with a great formula. I would certainly buy from Kaleidos again. Next in my best of category is a couple of eyeshadow palettes from ColourPop. And yes, I know ColourPop is known for launching new products every other day or maybe every day, depending on, what time of the year it is. But they have a solid eyeshadow formula that I have come to love. While their packaging may not always impress, I think the quality of their shadows is spectacular, and that's why I continue to buy eyeshadows from them. And I've got 3 palettes that I'm going to talk about very briefly. The first palette that's going to be going into my best of category is the Dream Street palette. This is a collaboration that ColourPop did with Kathleen Lights. I love this palette. I love the pops of color. I also love how neutral it is. This is certainly a palette that you can get quite a bit of use out of. You've got a bunch of different mattes, lots of shimmers in here, so it is a one and done palette, something that obviously appeals to me. And the packaging, albeit being simple, I think is still colorful and very easy to store. I love it. The other palette that belongs in my best of category is the Sweet Talk palette. This is one that I recently acquired in my collection, but it is a good old faithful palette. It's got lots of beautiful corals. You've also got a couple of glitter eyeshadows in here. It's just very aesthetically appealing and easy to wear. It's a good everyday palette, and again, a one and done. And lastly from ColourPop is my Disney Villains palette. This is the Misunderstood palette. At first, I just wanted to give this palette an honorable mention, but the more I kind of pondered on it, the more I realized I've used this palette quite a bit because I love the shimmer shadows in here. Now, this isn't a palette that is a one and done. That's the only unfortunate part, although it can be. So it kind of breaks one of my rules, but I think there are enough matte eyeshadows in here where you can get a color down in your crease and then make some of the metallic colors work for you. But I really like the metallic formula. I love the shades in here. They are a little bit darker, a little bit more smoky, but what a beautiful homage to Disney Villains. Another indie brand that I have loved for a while is Colored Raine, and I'm putting their Power palette in my best of category because it just screams Dimitra to me. Every time I look at this, I just fall in love with the colors all over again. I love how pigmented they are. They blend beautifully, and this has staying power. What an eyeshadow formula. I absolutely adore it, and I don't think I could have made this video without including this palette in there. Another indie brand that just makes my heart flutter, and I think they produce some of the best eyeshadow palettes out there, is Beaute. They have 2 eyeshadow palettes that are going to be going into my best of 2019 eyeshadow category. The first is going to be the Oceanic palette, and let me tell you, this palette here just calls my name. I love these blue and green eyeshadows. I am wearing primarily this palette all over my eyes today. I think even though there's lots of bold color in here, you can still do quite a bit with this palette. You can make looks a little more subdued, or you can go super dark and smoky. You can even do bright pops of colors with this. I think it's a pretty versatile palette despite the, crazy color story, which in my opinion really isn't crazy, but to some it might be. Beaute has such a wonderful eyeshadow formula. It is extremely pigmented, blends well, it's got great staying power. Oh, it's to die for. Their Paradise collection is at the top of my list of my all-time favorite palettes. I gravitate towards those palettes a lot, but because they're a little bit older, I didn't want to include them in this video. But instead, I'm including the Flaire palette, which is also super bright, yet very versatile. It is a one and done palette. I think you've got a great variety of color in here, a mix of mattes and metallics, and the formula, again, is just delightful. The next palette I'm putting in my best of category comes from Dominique Cosmetics, and it is the Berries and Cream eyeshadow palette. I believe this came out in December of 2018, so this is a little more than a year ago, but I figured it's so close to 2019 that I might as well include it because it is a palette that I reach for quite frequently. I love the berry tones that are in here. I love how neutral it is, but that you also get a couple of pops of color in here, so you can really make this palette work hard for you. The formula is very soft and buttery. It blends well. It's very pigmented. It's just an all-around awesome palette to have. Another palette that belongs in my best of category comes from BH Cosmetics. This is the Take Me to Ibiza, or Ibiza, I don't know how you actually pronounce that, palette. And this is what it looks like. I think it is so beautiful. You have so many fun colors in here. And while some of these colors might look a little bit bright and intimidating, there are enough neutral shades in here where I think you can still create more wearable everyday looks. I think this palette has a lot of versatility, and the eyeshadow formula is wonderful. And to be quite honest with you, I think the BH Cosmetics eyeshadow formula is one of the most underrated in the beauty community. Another palette that is a little bit on the older side, but it's one that I've actually reached for a lot, especially this past spring and summer. It comes from Jeffree Star, and it is the Thirsty palette. I can't believe how much use I've actually been able to get out of this eyeshadow palette. And it is one that I initially bought and I was like, oh, why did I buy it? I'm never gonna use it. And then I ended up digging into it a lot. These glitter colors over here I initially did not like, but once I got the hang of applying them, they ended up really making my eyes pop. The matte shadows are all wonderful. The only color in here that I find to be a little problematic is this one here, and only because I find it doesn't give off a lot of pigment, so it's not true to pan. I mean, you can sit there and try to build it up, but I don't want to have to work that hard for eyeshadow. But the rest of this palette is just delightful. I love the packaging. It's overall awesome, and again, very versatile. The other palette from Jeffree Star Cosmetics that I have to put in my best of category is the Blue Blood palette. I love this color scheme so much. I think it is beautiful. You've got so many cool shades in here that you can work with. And while there are a lot of bold blue shades in this palette, I think you still have quite a few neutral colors so that you can create more everyday looks with this too. While the packaging of this is very different and bold and beautiful, very artistic to a certain degree, I think it is a little bit challenging to store. I actually have a hard time fitting this into my drawers, unfortunately, but I love the guts of it, so that's why I keep it around. The next eyeshadow palette I'm going to talk about comes from Tati Beauty. This is the Textured Neutrals Palette Volume 1. And I realize I only recently acquired this palette, but I have been loving it ever since it came into my collection. I think all of these colors are just so beautiful. It is the everyday palette, or the every person's palette. Tons of neutral colors in here. You also get some fun glitters that you get to play with. I think there's so much that you can do with this, and this is certainly a one and done palette. There is so much versatility in this, and the eyeshadow formula is delightful. And the last palette I'm going to talk about in my best of category is the Anastasia Beverly Hills Riviera palette. And the reason I'm putting this in my best of category is because this is such a different palette from anything that I think Anastasia has ever put out before. I think this color story is just beautiful. There's lots of bright pops of color in here, but again, it's still neutral enough where you can get everyday everyday wear out of this as well. I am wearing Seychelles all over my lid today, and it's just giving me that beautiful pop of blue that I was looking for with some of the matte shadows that I use for my Beaute Oceanic palette. It is undeniable that the Anastasia eyeshadow formula is amazing. I think their pressed pigments do come with more of a learning curve. What I've learned when it comes to working with the ABH pressed pigment formula is that you have to dip your brush into the pigment and then stamp it onto your eye. And once you have the color in place wherever you want it to be, then you can go in with gentle motions and blend the pigment out. I find that is the only way you can get these pigments to wear really well on your eyes. If you over blend them, they are going to fade away really quickly, and then you have to go back in and re-intensify. So just be wary of that. Their pressed pigment formula does come with a bit of a learning curve. I think Cannes, Bahamas, and a couple of other colors in here were pressed pigments. Overall, I think this is a wonderful palette, and it certainly veers away from a lot of the more neutral palettes that Anastasia is known to come out with. And this palette actually bridges really well into my worst of category, or my palettes that aren't just getting enough love from me. And I say that because Anastasia has come out with so many palettes, and there have been so many launches from the brand this past year that it's actually become a little overwhelming, and quite honestly, it's turned me off as a consumer. In years past, Anastasia would only release 1 or 2 palettes, I think at most per year, and that meant there was a lot of thought being put into those launches. I think their collections were a little better curated than what's been coming out recently. If you disagree with me, that's okay. If you agree with me, awesome. But I unfortunately fell into the hype, and that's the main reason why I purchased the next palette that I'm going to talk about, and it is the first one that's going to go into my not so great category. Unfortunately, it's the Alyssa Edwards and Anastasia collaboration. Truthfully, the only reason I purchased this palette is because I love Alyssa Edwards as a queen. I kind of wish I didn't, not because the formula sucks, but it's just a palette I don't use. And I know what you're gonna say. Oh my god, the colors, Dimitra, it screams colors. Why don't you use this? Because there are so many other eyeshadow palettes that I have that have a better color scheme than this. And if you look really closely at my palette, you'll see that most of these colors are untouched. I think I've only actually dove into this deep purple color here, the metallic purple next to it. I dove into this gold color just a little bit, and this other purple color here, and everything else remains untouched, which is a bit of a shame, really. I don't want to go on record saying that this is the worst palette of the year. It absolutely is not, but it's just a palette that I probably should not have purchased. I fell into the hype and the marketing that went into the launch of this palette, and I don't know, these colors aren't really screaming my name. This isn't a palette that I would necessarily take with me to any vacation destination. It's not a palette that has ever sat out on my vanity. I've barely touched it, so unfortunately this is going into my not so loved category. Alongside the Alyssa palette, I'm also going to be including the Norvina palette. This is the Volume 3 Pro Pigment palette, and I'm really upset with myself for not returning this when I had the opportunity. When this palette is photographed, I think it looks beautiful. You have a lot of different bright pops of color in here, which a lot of people would probably gravitate towards. But honestly, this formula for me is just problematic. I did mention when I talked about the Riviera palette that the pigment formula from Anastasia is certainly different from their regular eyeshadow formula. And I think this pigment formula is even more different than the pigments that you can find in their regular eyeshadow palettes. I find this formula actually to be very problematic. Even when you go in with stamping motions to get the color in place, I find once you start blending, you actually blend the color away. So it's really hard to get the vibrancy of the colors that you see in the pan here. So I don't think that a lot of these colors are true to pan, which is quite unfortunate. I also think the metallics are a little bit lackluster. I don't find them to be super shiny, which is something that I would expect from a palette like this. And the packaging for me is okay. I mean, I don't mind a plastic package, but it's just a little bit bulky, a little more difficult to store. It's not one that I'm happy to have in my collection, and it's not one that I have really used much since I reviewed it. I think there were a couple of other times that I wore a few of these shadows on my eyes, and I was disappointed every time I wore it. So unfortunately, this is something that's going in my not so loved category. And if I'm being entirely honest, I'm actually a little bit miffed about this palette because it was advertised as an Anastasia palette, but then we learned that Norvina is creating her own brand within Anastasia, and this was outsourced to China. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. A lot of my favorite brands actually manufacture their palettes overseas in China. But Anastasia has always prided themselves on making everything in the US. And when I realized this was made in Asia, it just made me think that it was a money grab. They wanted to decrease their production costs as much as possible and increase their profit margins. That's basically what it tells me. This palette was manufactured in China, so Norvina could make a lot more money. I could be completely wrong about that. That could be a conspiracy theory, but that's another reason that I dislike this palette. And I probably subconsciously steered clear of it because of that reason. And the last palette I am putting in my not so loved category is unfortunately this one here from BH Cosmetics. This is the Color Festival palette from this past year. This is what it, oh come on, protective layer. This is what it looks like, and meh. While I enjoy the formulation of these particular shadows, I actually don't understand this color story at all. There's really no color story. It's just a mishmash of colors that were thrown together. At least that's what I see. Sure, you can take these colors row by row and some of them will make sense, kind of like what Tarte has done with some of their larger palettes in the past. But to me, this was just a fail because it wasn't as good as its predecessor. I have the Weekend Festival palette from a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, I can't quite remember now, but this is what it looked like. And man, these colors here really spoke to me. While they aren't super bright pops of color, I think there's so much that you can do with this palette, and it is certainly very versatile, which is something that I cannot necessarily say about this palette here. And if I put them side by side, you can see that this one here certainly has gotten a lot more love from me, but it feels a little more wearable than this particular palette. And for that reason, and that reason alone, it's going into my not so loved category. And that's gonna do it for this video. And of course, I now wanna hear from you. Let me know in the comment section what some of your favorite palettes were from this past year. And also, don't forget to dish the dirt on the palettes that sucked or that didn't make your most loved list. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know the drill. Give it a big thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always do that by following me on all of my social media, which I will link for you in the description box below. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope you are all having an amazing day and a very happy new year, and I can't wait to see you in my next video. Bye!